This video is about a tax that every American is paying right now that nobody voted on, nobody approved, and nobody is calling a tax. It is being charged to you at the gas pump, at the grocery store, on your mortgage statement, and inside your retirement account. It has no official name, it does not appear on any government form, and the people responsible for it are not calling it a cost at all. They are calling it a war. Pull a dollar bill out of your wallet and look at it for a second. What you are holding is cotton and linen fiber worth almost nothing in physical terms, and yet you can walk into any store in America, hand it over, and walk out with real goods. That has been true your entire life. What is also true, starting 23 days ago, is that same dollar bill is buying 32% less gasoline than it bought you on February 26th. Not because the Federal Reserve printed more of them, not because inflation hit a new record. Because on February 28, 2026, a decision was made in a room you were never invited into. And that single decision placed a hidden surcharge on every transaction in your financial life, running simultaneously through 5 separate channels, growing every single day that the Strait of Hormuz stays closed and the bombs keep falling. That is what this video is going to walk you through, not at a national level, not in trillion-dollar abstractions that feel like they belong to someone else's life, in the specific measurable numbers that are already showing up on your gas receipt, your grocery bill, your mortgage statement, and your retirement account balance. Because the honest truth about what this war is costing you is not in any Pentagon briefing and not in any White House press release. It is in the data. And the data is not hard to read if someone sits down and reads it with you. I have spent my career studying how geopolitical decisions made in rooms you will never enter produce financial consequences in lives you are actually living. Born in Guangdong, raised in Toronto, educated at Yale, and teaching in Beijing for years, I have watched American economic power from the outside and from the inside both. And what I know from that vantage point is this: the most dangerous financial shocks are never the ones that announce themselves. They are the ones that arrive quietly, spread through channels most people do not know exist, and have already done significant damage before the average household realizes what is happening. That is exactly what is happening right now. So let us go through it, channel by channel, number by number, with no abstractions and no hedging, because you deserve to understand what is actually being taken from you and why. Start at the gas pump, because that is the channel everyone can see and most people underestimate. On February 26, 2026, 2 days before the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran, the national average price of a gallon of regular gasoline in the United States was $2.98. That number matters because it is the baseline. It is what your financial life was calibrated to on the last normal day before the war. Today, that number is $3.94. A 32% increase in 23 days, the largest 3-day gasoline price spike since Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, according to analysis from Bespoke Investment Group. Diesel, which powers every 18-wheeler truck that moves every product from every warehouse to every store in America, has risen 28% to $4.83 a gallon. Now here is the number that makes this personal. The average American household spends approximately $2,500 per year filling their tank. A 32% increase on that baseline adds $800 to your annual fuel bill, not $800 split across the whole country. $800 out of your household specifically. And that is at current prices, which Goldman Sachs this week projected could remain elevated through 2027. But the gas pump is the visible surface of a much larger structure underneath, because diesel does not just power your car, it powers the farm equipment that harvests every crop in America. It powers the trucks that move those crops from fields to processing facilities. It powers the refrigerated vehicles that carry finished food products from distribution centers to the store 3 miles from your house. Every single step in that chain runs on diesel. And when diesel rises 28%, every single step in that chain gets more expensive. The cost does not evaporate somewhere in the middle. It passes forward. It always passes forward. It ends at the checkout counter, in your cart, on your receipt. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's, said this week, and I am going to quote him directly because the precision matters, "Consumers threaten to be hammered by the surge in oil prices. If oil prices stay near current levels, inflation will quickly accelerate, cutting into consumers' purchasing power and hitting consumer spending, GDP, and jobs. That assessment came when oil was at $100 a barrel. Oil is now at $114. The second channel is the one almost nobody is talking about yet, which is why it is the most dangerous one. It is the fertilizer channel. And to understand why it matters, you need to understand one fact about how your food is actually produced. Modern agriculture runs on nitrogen fertilizer the way your car runs on gasoline. Without it, crop yields collapse by somewhere between 40 and 60% on standard American corn and soybean fields. The primary ingredient used to produce nitrogen fertilizer is natural gas, and roughly 1/3 of all the fertilizer that moves across global trade routes passes through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed since March 4th, 23 days and counting. Here is what that means in concrete terms. Urea prices at the New Orleans import hub, which is the primary entry point for nitrogen fertilizer into American agriculture, jumped 32% in the first week of the war alone, from $506 per metric ton on February 27 to $683 per metric ton by March 5. By March 9, according to analysis from CSIS, 1 ton of urea cost American farmers the equivalent of 126 bushels of corn. In December 2025, that same ton of urea cost 75 bushels. That is a 68% cost increase for American farmers in 90 days. And here is the detail that should alarm you more than the number itself. Spring planting season is happening right now. The window during which American corn and soybean farmers apply fertilizer to their fields runs from late March through early May. That window does not move. If fertilizer supply is disrupted during that window, farmers reduce their application rates, crop yields decline, and the consequences show up at your grocery store in September, October, and November, months after the war has presumably ended, months after the gas prices have come down, long after the news cycle has moved on. Jiang Xueqin, an Illinois farmer who grows corn and soybeans, told CNN this week that prices for nitrogen are going up so fast that suppliers will not even commit to a price in advance. His exact words were, "When I call a retailer right now, I could not get a price on any nitrogen source out there. That is not a supply shortage yet. That is a market seized up by uncertainty, which historically precedes a shortage by about 6 to 8 weeks." Noah Gordon, a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, told NPR that fertilizer prices are up around 30% more in some parts of the world. Researchers at Live Science warned this week that fertilizer shocks do not register with the same immediacy as oil shocks. Petrol prices change overnight. Crop yields reveal themselves months later. Yet the latter may prove more destabilizing. Central banks focused primarily on fuel-driven inflation could underestimate the contribution of fertilizer scarcity to overall prices entirely. Food prices have already risen nearly 24% above pre-COVID levels. Grocery prices rose 0.4% from January to February before the war even started. If the fertilizer disruption runs through the planting window, which it is on track to do, the economists I am reading this week are projecting another significant shock to food prices in the second half of 2026, on top of what you are already paying, on top of the gas price shock, on top of everything else I'm about to describe. The Iran war is not just an energy crisis. The International Energy Agency's own director called it the greatest global energy and food security challenge in history. That is the language of the world's leading energy authority. It deserves to be taken seriously. The third channel is the one hitting people who have been doing everything right. The responsible ones, the people who have been saving, delaying gratification, building toward the day they can finally buy a home. Because 2 days before this war started, something happened in the American housing market that had not happened since 2022. Mortgage rates fell below 6% for the first time in 4 years. On February 26th, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate sat at 5.98%, below 6%. A number that economists described as a key psychological threshold, the level at which housing market confidence tends to revive, and people who had been sitting on the sidelines finally feel like they can move. The housing market was, in the language of one analyst, gliding toward its first real growth year in existing home sales in years. Then, on February 28th, the bombs fell, and that number began climbing. By March 5th, it was back above 6. By March 12, it had reached 6.11%. By March 19, it hit its highest level in more than 3 months. As of this week, it stands at 6.53%, a full half-point increase in 23 days. Let me make that concrete for you. On a $400,000 home purchase, which is close to the median home price in the United States, a half-point increase in your mortgage rate adds approximately $130 per month to your payment. That is $1,560 per year. Over the 30-year life of the loan, that is $46,800 in additional interest that you will pay to your bank for a decision made by your government in a war you had no vote on. The hidden tax in this channel alone runs to nearly $47,000 on a single median home purchase. The reason this is happening is worth understanding because it is not how wars normally work. Usually when geopolitical crises hit, investors flee to U.S. Treasury bonds as a safe haven, which pushes bond prices up and yields down. And since mortgage rates follow the 10-year Treasury yield, rates typically fall or stay flat during conflict. That is the historical pattern. This time the pattern broke. This time inflation fears from surging oil prices are overpowering the flight to safety dynamic. The bond market is selling off because investors are pricing in persistent inflation, which pushes Treasury yields up, which pushes mortgage rates up. Fear of higher prices is beating out fear of global instability. That is not a reassuring trade. Jeff Dergarahian, Chief Investment Officer at Loan Depot, told CNN, without the geopolitical tensions, we would likely be seeing a 10-year Treasury well south of 4%, with mortgage rates in the high 5s. What you are paying above that is the war surcharge on your housing costs. And there is a compounding problem underneath the rate number itself. Before the war, economists were projecting 2 to 3 Federal Reserve rate cuts in 2026, which would have pulled mortgage rates down further over the course of the year. Those rate cuts are now gone. CME FedWatch shows a 99% probability the Fed holds rates steady in March, 95% in April, 77% in June. Fed Governor Christopher Waller told CNBC this week that he had planned to vote for a rate cut at last Wednesday's meeting. The Iran war changed his mind. His exact words, "This is looking like it's going to be a much more protracted conflict, and oil prices are going to stay high for a longer time." So that suggested inflation was more of a concern. The rate cuts that were supposed to help you afford a home in 2026 are not coming. And depending on how long the war continues, there is now a 50% probability priced into futures markets that the Fed raises rates before the end of the year, which would push mortgage rates higher still. The fourth channel is the one that affects more than half of all American adults, whether they think of themselves as investors or not. It is the stock market. And specifically, it is the retirement accounts, the 401ks and IRAs, that represent decades of deferred spending for millions of American households. The last 4 weeks on Wall Street have been the worst 4-week period since April 2025, when President Trump's Liberation Day tariff announcement triggered a global market sell-off. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ Composite have posted 4 straight weeks of declines. The Dow Jones fell nearly 800 points in a single session when U.S. crude oil broke above $80 per barrel, reigniting the inflation fears that the bond market was already pricing. Asian markets have been hit harder. The Nikkei 225 and South Korea's Kospi are both down roughly 12% since the war began. The Hang Seng and Taiwan's TAIEX have lost around 7 to 8% each. For someone in their 30s or 40s with a long investment horizon, a 4-week drawdown is uncomfortable but recoverable. Markets have bounced back from worse. But for the person who is 5 years from retirement, who has been watching their portfolio grow for 2 decades and is now close to the finish line, this is a different kind of pain, because that person cannot afford to wait out another decade of recovery. A significant drawdown at the wrong moment in the savings life cycle is not a temporary discomfort. It is a permanent reduction in retirement income. Here is what makes this particular downturn structurally unusual and why the standard reassurances about long-term investing require more scrutiny right now. Normally in a market crisis, a 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, acts as a stabilizer. When stocks fall, bonds typically rise. cushioning the blow. That cushion is not working this time. Stocks are falling and bond yields are rising simultaneously, which means bond prices are falling too. The part of your retirement portfolio designed to protect you from exactly this kind of equity drawdown is losing value at the same time as your equities. Both the aggressive part and the conservative part of a standard retirement allocation are moving in the wrong direction together. Goldman Sachs has raised its recession probability within 12 months to 25%, up 5 percentage points since the war began. That is not a prediction of a recession. That is a meaningful increase in the probability of one at a moment when your retirement account is already down, your mortgage rate is up, your gas bill is higher, and your grocery bill is about to get worse. The fifth channel is the one that almost nobody has connected to the war yet because it is hidden inside a political story rather than a financial one. It is the tax cut offset, one of the central economic promises of the current administration. An argument made publicly and repeatedly is that the tax cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act would put money back in American pockets. Lower withholding, larger refunds, more take-home pay. The political logic being that visible financial relief would offset the public's discomfort with the trade war turbulence earlier in the year. Fortune reported this week, with a headline that deserves to be read carefully, that higher gasoline prices this year are almost exactly offsetting the boost from Trump's tax cuts. The phrasing is precise, not partially offsetting, not modestly reducing, almost exactly offsetting. The tax cut that was supposed to be the financial centerpiece of the administration's domestic agenda is being canceled out at the household level by the gas price shock from a war that same administration launched. The average IRS tax refund this year is up 10.8% according to recent filing data. That is real money. For a household receiving a $3,000 refund, a 10.8% increase means roughly $324 more than last year. At $3.94 per gallon and $800 extra per year in fuel costs for the average household, that $324 is more than consumed. You received a tax cut with your right hand, and the war took more than that out of your left hand simultaneously, through a channel that never appears on a tax document and never gets reported as a cost of the conflict. That is the definition of a hidden tax. You cannot see it on any statement. You cannot deduct it. You cannot appeal it. It simply arrives, spread across hundreds of small transactions, embedded in the price of everything that requires energy to produce or transport or refrigerate or deliver, which is everything. Now I want to be precise about the counter-argument, because serious people make it, and dismissing it would be intellectually dishonest. The United States is the world's largest oil producer. We are a net energy exporter. Trump noted this week that when oil prices go up, America makes a lot of money. That is factually accurate. Higher oil prices benefit American energy companies, benefit states like Texas and North Dakota and Oklahoma, and generate tax revenues and royalty payments from federal lands. If you own stock in American energy companies, your portfolio has outperformed the broader market significantly since February 28th. The argument also runs that this is temporary. Wars end, the strait reopens, oil comes down, the Fed cuts, mortgage rates follow, markets recover. The economy bounces back stronger because the geopolitical uncertainty that was holding investment back is resolved. Every previous oil shock in American history has eventually ended, prices have eventually normalized, and the economy has eventually recovered. There is no reason to believe this time is structurally different if the conflict ends within a reasonable time frame. These arguments deserve to be taken seriously. They have historical support and they come from credible economists and analysts who are not simply cheerleading for the administration. The honest response to them runs like this. The word eventually is doing a great deal of work in that analysis, and it is doing that work invisibly. Eventually the war ends. Eventually rates come down. Eventually markets recover. But eventually is not a financial plan for the person who needs to close on a house in April. It is not a retirement strategy for the person who turns 65 in September. It is not a grocery budget for the family that is already spending more on food than they were a year ago. The people for whom eventually is an adequate answer are the people with enough financial cushion to wait. which is a significant portion of the population, but it is not all of it. And the people for whom it is not an adequate answer tend to be the ones least able to absorb a sustained shock. There is also a compounding problem that the temporary framing does not adequately address. Fertilizer prices are not temporary in the way that gas prices are. Gas prices respond quickly when oil comes down. Crop yields from a disrupted planting season do not recover until the following growing cycle at the earliest. Inflation that gets embedded in consumer expectations once it circulates through wage negotiations and supply contracts does not reverse quickly even when the underlying commodity shock ends. The Fed's own history shows this. The 1973 oil shock was over in about a year. The inflation it seeded took a decade to fully kill. The treatment, Paul Volcker's 20% interest rates, was more painful for ordinary Americans than the shock itself. So what does this mean for the specific decisions in front of you right now? I want to be direct here because vague reassurances are not what this situation calls for. The first question is about your fuel exposure. If you are in a position to reduce discretionary driving, reduce it. Not as panic, as arithmetic. At $3.94 and rising, every unnecessary mile has a higher cost than it did 3 weeks ago. If you drive for work or live in a situation where driving is not optional, build the higher cost into your household budget now, rather than discovering it in 3 months through accumulated credit card charges. The second question is about your grocery strategy. The fertilizer shock will not show up fully at your grocery store for several months. What is already showing up is the fuel surcharge on transportation and the initial commodity price movements. The full agricultural cost impact hits later in the year. If your household budget has flexibility, this is the moment to build a modest food staple buffer. Not hoarding, not panic buying, but the kind of deliberate household inventory management that your grandparents' generation treated as basic financial prudence. The third question is the housing question, and it is the most time-sensitive. If you were planning to buy a home this spring and you are relying on a rate environment close to where it was before the war, that environment no longer exists. The rate trajectory for 2026 now runs upward under most scenarios, not downward. If you are in a situation where you need to decide whether to buy now at 6.53% or wait for rates to come back down, the honest answer is that nobody knows with confidence when they come back down, and the economists I am reading this week are not projecting a meaningful decline before late 2026 at the earliest. The fourth question is about retirement positioning. If you are more than 10 years from retirement, the standard long-term holding advice has historical support, and I would not contradict it. If you are within 5 years of retirement, the simultaneous decline in both equities and bonds I described earlier is a signal worth discussing with a financial professional who knows your specific situation. This is not the moment for panic selling, but it may be the moment for a conversation about whether your current allocation is appropriately positioned for the scenario where inflation persists longer than markets currently expect. I have taught history and geopolitics for a long time, long enough to understand a pattern that keeps repeating across centuries in different languages and different political systems. The pattern is this: the populations who pay the highest financial cost for wars are rarely the populations who made the decision to fight them. The decision is made at the top, the bill arrives at the bottom, not in the dramatic form of taxation that people can see and challenge. In the diffuse, invisible form of prices that rise and purchasing power that shrinks and opportunities that quietly disappear. The Roman legions were funded in part by currency debasement, mixing cheaper metals into silver coins, which produced inflation that hollowed out the savings of ordinary Romans who had no idea why their money was buying less each year. The British Empire ran its late-period wars largely on borrowed money, which produced the debt and interest burden that eventually forced the dismantling of the empire itself. The United States has a different mechanism. It is the world's reserve currency issuer, which gives it more room than any other nation in history to run deficits and borrow cheaply. But the room is not infinite, and the current combination of $37 trillion in national debt, $1 trillion per year in interest payments, and $1.5 billion per day in war costs is testing that room in ways that no previous American administration has had to manage simultaneously. What the Iran war has done in the 23 days since the first bombs fell on February 28th is impose a financial cost on every American household that nobody voted for, nobody approved, and nobody is accounting for in the official tallies of what the conflict costs. The $200 billion Pentagon budget request for Iran war operations is the visible number. The hidden number is the aggregate of 130 million American households, each absorbing $800 in higher fuel costs, higher grocery bills they cannot yet measure, mortgage rates that cost them tens of thousands of dollars in interest, retirement accounts that are down in ways that matter most for the people closest to the finish line, and a tax cut that was supposed to help them but has been consumed by the very war that was supposed to make the country more secure. That is the hidden tax. It is not dramatic. It does not appear in a single headline. It is spread across hundreds of small transactions in millions of ordinary lives. But it is real, it is measurable, and it is growing every single day that the Strait of Hormuz stays closed and the war continues. My job is to tell you what I see, not what anyone wants to hear. And what I see right now, looking at the data from this week, is a financial cost being distributed across the American population in ways that are deliberately difficult to see, which is precisely what makes them worth looking at clearly. Pull out your wallet again. The money inside it is worth less than it was 23 days ago. Not dramatically less, not visibly less, but measurably, structurally, and persistently less. And understanding exactly why that is happening is the only starting point for deciding what to do about it. Thank you for watching.